things like alcohol and drugs, which we know that some communities, unfortunately, have greater access to those things than they do to healthy foods. A healthy community would also have access to affordable health care. And then from a mental health and even a social health standpoint, we would think about, again, having a safe community where people can interact and feel connected to one another and feel safe, as well as have access to things like green spaces, cultural outlets, and mental health services. So a healthy community is then one that really provides all of these things for people to live healthy, thriving lives. And I think one of the important things to recognize is that these factors, these environmental aspects of a community, really have a major impact on our health. And so in order to think about health, we have to think not only about the individual, but we have to think about the community where they live. And then the equity piece comes in when we talk about the fact that not all people have the opportunity to live in a community like that. And so those folks, particularly people of color, low income, people in rural communities or inner city communities, oftentimes have limited access to those health promoting factors that we would think of in a healthy community.
Okay. So what part does equity play in health outcomes?
Well, as I said, not everyone has the opportunity to live in a healthy community. People of color, lower income families, people in rural communities, other environments that lack those resources for people to live healthy, thriving lives are more likely to have poor health outcomes. And if we think about the United States and one of our core values of fairness, equity really becomes important because in reality, not everyone has a fair opportunity to be healthy. People who are without any fault of their own live in communities that lack these resources, as well as lack access to jobs, to affordable health care, to schools that are effective in educating folks so that they can thrive later in life. Those things don't really live up to our values as a community, and so equity is really important when we talk about health as well.
So there is a term that we use in the public health field called social determinants of health. Can you break that down for our listening audience?
Yeah, so the social determinants of health are really what we would call those social, those economic, and those environmental factors that shape our health outcomes. As I was describing what creates a healthy community, many of those things are what we talk about when we're thinking of social determinants of health. So whether there's places to be physically active, whether it's safe for people to be outside, whether they have access to healthy foods, whether there's jobs that pay a living wage and that provide people with health insurance, and education, transportation, safe housing, all of those things are social determinants of health. And the reason they're important is because when we look at the research, we find that the things we most likely think about health in terms of individual behaviors and access to health care account for about half of what shapes our health outcomes. The other half is these social determinants of health. And so if we're not addressing those, then we're not really getting at the root of why we see poor health, and in particular, why we see health inequities in our community.
So what you're saying in essence is a lot of times we see people in certain areas of the community who are unhealthy. Maybe they have a high incidence of high blood pressure or diabetes, or as we know in our families and friends, we find that folks are dying of heart attacks, or people are obese in our communities. And so oftentimes that comes with a shame of, oh, it must be my fault because I'm not eating healthy, I'm not exercising. But what you're saying is there are some underlying reasons why we might not be able to be healthy.
Yeah, I think certainly there's a role for folks taking initiative in terms of trying to be as healthy as they can, and at the same time we have to recognize that the choices that people make are shaped by the choices that they have. And so if you live in a community that lacks access to healthy foods, or it's easier to get cigarettes and alcohol than it is to walk safely down your street, then the odds are against you in terms of being able to practice those healthy behaviors. So I think it's important to recognize, one, the social determinants of health shape our behaviors because of the options we have available to us. They also shape whether we're exposed to things that we have no control over. So if we live in a community where there's a lot of violence, We can't control that individually. The violence is there, and we're at greater risk for being susceptible to it. Similarly, if we live in a house, particularly if we're renting, and we have poor indoor air quality, we have rodent infestations. We live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of like diesel fumes, particularly from bus transit routes. Then the risk of asthma, for example, is higher. And then also there's an added level of stress. So when people have the challenges of trying to live day to day, when the social determinants of health aren't set up to benefit them, and they're worried about whether they're going to be able to pay their rent for the month, or to be able to buy healthy foods for their kids, or whether their kids are going to be safe in their communities, they're experiencing a higher level of stress than folks who don't have those challenges. And what the research shows is that stress has a direct effect on our physical, mental, and social well-being. So the social determinants of health and the decisions that our society makes around who has access to healthy social determinants is really at the root of health inequities.
So now, what is the difference between health disparities and health inequities?
That's a good question, and I've been using the term health inequities. And so health disparities is really a general term. It's about differences in health outcomes. And it can be anything. It can be the fact that older people have a higher rate of heart attacks than the younger people. And part of that is because as we grow older, we have that just increased risk. Certainly some of it is some other factors as well. But that could potentially be just a health disparity. It's a difference that exists in health outcomes without any other factors being involved. Health inequity, on the other hand, is a disparity that is systemic. It affects different groups of people differently. It's preventable because ultimately they're related to how these social determinants of health are distributed across different communities and populations. And as a result, it's considered to be unfair. It's something that doesn't live up to our values as a society of giving everyone an opportunity to be healthy and to live a thriving life. And so I use the term health inequity because it really reflects that reality of what is shaping these differences in health outcomes that we're seeing affecting people of color, affecting low-income communities, rural communities, and other marginalized populations in our neighborhoods.
And so I want my audience to hear the words preventable. We heard unfair. Yeah, a lot of things in life are unfair, but I want our audience to hear the word preventable. So what role does racism play in creating unhealthy outcomes for people of color?
Great question. And I think ultimately racism is at the root of why we see inequities in health affecting people of color. And in order to explain that, I want to define what I mean by racism. And I think of racism as a system based on the belief in the superiority of whiteness that leads to the distribution of society's resources, opportunities, and burdens in a manner that disproportionately benefits whites at the expense of people of color. And what that means is that our society is set up in a way, as we know of the long history, that has always been set up to benefit the white population. And what I mean, if we think about the four levels of racism, there's the personal level where people have attitudes, beliefs about other groups. And then typically in our society, those attitudes and beliefs are negative related to people of color. We know all the stereotypes around, negative stereotypes related to black people, to Latinos, to Native Americans, to others. And then at the second level, there's this interpersonal, which is what people usually think about when they think about racism, of treating someone differently or in an inferior way because you buy into those beliefs around race. And so typically that plays out where people of color are discriminated against in one way or another in our society on the individual level. The third level I want to talk about is at the institutional level. And this relates to that definition I gave, that not only is it that people are treated differently at the individual level, but our society is set up to benefit white people in general at the expense of people of color. And so if we look at the institutions that shape our society, whether it's housing, schools, healthcare, criminal justice, we could go down the list. These are all the institutions that shape our society. And if we look at the data, we clearly know that there are very significant inequities in outcomes along those institutions of our society by race. And that is by design within this context of what we think about racism is. So we know that educational outcomes are poor for African American and Latinos. We know that healthcare outcomes and treatment options are different and oftentimes inferior for people of color. We know that the criminal justice system is racially biased. And so these institutions have been set up through this long history to benefit whiteness at the expense of people of color. And then the fourth level is the cultural. And that is really about how, as a society, we view people's values, their norms, their beliefs. And it kind of relates to those stereotypes we have about people of color, but it's much more extensive than that. And it really ties into this idea that things that are associated with whiteness are superior to things that are associated with people of color. And why this definition of racism is important is that it really helps us to think about why health inequities by race are so extensive and pervasive. Data shows that people who report being the victim of racist incidents, of being treated in a discriminatory manner, are more likely to engage in unhealthy behaviors such as to smoke or to drink, most likely as a way to self-medicate related to these issues. They're also more likely to act out against people who are like them. So we see poor health in that way. And at the institutional level, that's really around those social determinants of health. People live in communities that either have access to these opportunities that allow them to be healthy or they don't. And much of that is based on race. When we think about residential racial segregation, Native Americans being put on reservations, all of these things are about the institutional level. And the cultural goes to that idea that some people are superior to others and others are inferior. And that internalized kind of level of across society of telling people that they're less than has a negative impact on their mental health as well as on their behaviors as well. The one point I do want to make, and I know I'm going on for a long time, is the other side of this is there's one group that's disadvantaged and there's one group that's privileged by this, and that's that racism privileges whites. And so we have to think about not only how folks are disadvantaged, but how the system also privileges white people in a way so that we can ultimately address it, because it's at the root of why we see these poor health outcomes.
So, and thank you for that, Dr. Royster. So does social status and wealth shield people of color from health inequities? So I make, 6 figures and I'm a doctor, and I live in a really affluent neighborhood. Does that shield me from racism?
It doesn't shield me from racism, but it affects how I experience racism. So I think in general, if we look at the studies that have been done, higher income or higher wealth people of color have better health outcomes in general than lower income people of color. However, if you compare the people of color to white people, their health is still not at the level of their white counterparts. And that goes to not only the institutional level of racism, but the broader cultural and even the interpersonal, that while a person of color, I can give an example from my family, because we live in a predominantly white neighborhood. There are a few families of color, but my kids, have certain advantages when we think about social determinants of health in terms of the school that they go to in the neighborhood they live in. And at the same time, they experience a good amount of that interpersonal and that cultural level of racism, where they are, from time to time have kids saying negative things to them because they're black. They also live in a cultural world where they recognize that their blackness is not as valued or is not valued compared to whiteness. And so we see things about, concerns about, hair and, kids making comments to them about about what they think black people really are based on the cultural messages that they've received. And so even African Americans who live in a community that has a lot of opportunities to be healthy still experience some of those adverse aspects of racism, and that adds to that stress that, as a black person in particular, I have to, things that I have to worry about or think about on a daily basis that a white person who's in a similar social status as me wouldn't have to. And so racism, again, we think about it at the institutional level. There's also these other levels that affect people regardless of where they are in that socioeconomic spectrum.
All right. Thank you for that. Ms. Shakima Sanders says hello. We know Shakima Sanders. We have worked with Shakima. Hello, Shakima.
Hey,
Call
Shakima.
us, Shakima. We invite a very engaging conversation. If you're with us locally, you can call us at 804-788-0990. You can also call toll free at 1-877-873-5642. And I want to kind of scoot over and talk to our other guests today. One, Mr. Bradley Cox, and we also have Adyam, Redae, and Kia Reed with us. And I really want to come. Now, we've laid a lot of foundation on what racism is, and I really want to get to the personal impact of racism. And the reason for that is because I think a lot of times when we hear in our media and we hear socially about racism, we don't oftentimes really connect a true individual story to it. We see things on TV, blah, 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 blah. But I really wanted to talk about the individual stories and how racism impacts us. So, good morning, Bradley.
Good morning.
Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And have you had any impacts, positive or negative, of racism?
So I guess for those of you who can't see me, I am white.
Scoot
so
up.
that's going to...
You want to scoot over? I think we can see you. We see you. We see you
well,
on
for
Facebook.
those of you on the radio. So I would say that my experience with racism is probably going to be a little bit different than you might anticipate from that question. But I think what Dr. Royster was speaking on in terms of the social determinants of health and the levels of racism is a really important way to kind of consider that question. I think for a lot of white people, when we think about, oh, well, I'm not really impacted by racism, even if we're, well-meaning white people, we, believe all the right things or whatever. Racism can impact you in ways that are positive in addition to ways that are negative. So just as a white male in this society, I benefit from racism every day. And that can be in all levels of racism. So in the interpersonal manner, people will take me more seriously than they might a person of color who's saying the exact same thing as me. That can help me sort of navigate professional spaces better. I can be in a workplace and have a man bun and tattoos and stuff like that, and not have to worry about being judged as anything other than my individual self. So I'm not lumped in as a part of a group, and I don't have that burden of having to represent everybody or anybody besides me. And then from the institutional level, just growing up white in a white neighborhood has certainly benefited me, just having access to all those resources. Growing up in a neighborhood that I wasn't exposed to the same type of air pollution that I might have had I grown up somewhere else. So I think racism impacts white people on a daily basis in ways that we don't even always think about and don't always realize, even those of us who might not otherwise have any other reason to believe that we do, or any contact with other individuals that don't look like ourselves.
And so we call that privilege. And you recognize that.
A lot of people are afraid of that word, but yes, I would call it privilege.
Yeah. And I don't know why people are afraid of that word. And maybe because of the lens that I look through. Do you have thoughts on why people are afraid of that word?
I think for white people in particular, these aren't necessarily issues that, this is part of the privilege, right? These aren't issues that we really necessarily have to think about until we're confronted by them. And so for a lot of people, it can feel like, I think, a personal attack. Nobody wants to believe that they've been handed anything, right? And so for me, I work hard, I achieve all of these things. I don't want somebody coming in and telling me, oh, like, you didn't work hard for this, we're giving it to them as a product of your being white in society. And so I think people take that personally. I think what they don't recognize is that both can be true, right? You can work hard and you can achieve great things, and you can also benefit from your position in society on your route to doing that. That, there's a certain amount of luck that's involved in any amount of success. And I think that, for any one person that works hard and makes it, you can point to 100 people that worked just as hard and didn't. And I think it's worth examining which people work hard and make it and which people don't.
Bradley, I appreciate you coming here today, and I do not want you to be, I am the token and I'm speaking for all white people today. And so, the mic fell.
Just pick it up.
So in my questioning to you is really more of trying to understand as I'm holding the mic over here. So one of the things that I'd like to understand is that so tell me how your family sort of responds to racism. Do you have a family that is as open as you are in terms of understanding?
I would like to think so, yeah. I think it's interesting, I grew up in a progressive family. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, in a white neighborhood, but it was part of a school district that was majority black. So as I sort of moved up in the educational, my elementary school was largely white, middle school was a little bit more mixed, high school was majority black. And I think, my parents had very intentional beliefs about continuing to, send their kids to public schools. Certainly among middle-class white people, there's a lot of white flight that happens, and that's certainly not exclusive to Atlanta. That definitely happens here in Richmond as well. But sort of this negative connotation of attending schools that are majority black, even if those aren't explicitly like racist ideas, but there's definitely some level of implicit bias that goes into making those decisions when people are really just trying to do what's best for their kids or whatever. So that being said, I think that experience more than anything else really helped shape me and my beliefs and views about race in America. So I'm really grateful that my parents were able to see that and put value in that, and that really shaped me a lot growing up. So I appreciate them for that.
Okay. And so my last question is, when you experience or hear, or we recently went through this wonderful workshop together, when you hear racism, because people feel more free to say racist things around you, feeling like maybe you share the same views. When you hear that, how do you respond?
That's a challenge. I think it depends on the context, obviously. Sometimes it's easier if you hear something from somebody that you already have maybe a pre-existing relationship with. It's sometimes easier to maybe take them aside and call them out or whatever and say, hey, let's unpack that statement. Sometimes it's harder when it's people that you don't know, and I think that's it's a challenge for well-meaning white people, right? Because
that's a cute statement. Well-meaning white people.
Well, we can be intimidated by having to take on that burden, especially when it doesn't feel like it's necessarily our responsibility. So, for me personally, I think I've enjoyed sort of putting my views out there into the universe. I used to do some writing, going on a show like this, things of that nature. Sometimes having those personal conversations, for me personally, can be a little bit more challenging. But I know some other people that are kind of exactly the opposite. Taking it back to my family, I know my dad has a lot of friends who have different beliefs on the political spectrum, and some of that definitely impacts their views on race. And he has a lot of conversations with those people that very much disagree with him, and I commend him for that, because that's so much harder for me to do. I think it's a collective effort. You know, we need both. We need people that are willing to shout things out from a mountaintop, and we need people that are willing to engage on an interpersonal level with people they disagree with. And I think for any like real change to happen, there has to be both.
Thank you for that. I want to have a little conversation while we're switching up, and so Dr. Royster and Kia and Adyam and Bradley, so we can bring our other two guests on board. And take a look at some of our feedback from our Facebook viewers. So author Stacey Hardney Scott is on, and she said the benefit is called privilege, yes, and because if they accept it, they have to acknowledge that they have it. Lynn Whiting says that she likes honesty, that Bradley, you're very comfortable with your dialogue, which to me shows that you're being authentic and you're not struggling to make up responses to your inquiries. Like that. Dawn Bradley is watching. John Daniel, happy Sunday. And Shantanese Jackson says howdy. Okay, so now I think moving forward, hello ladies, Miss Adyam and Miss Kia Reed.
Hello.
How are you? Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you for having us.
So Kia,
Oh gosh.
Kia, for those who don't know, she's also my oldest daughter. Have you been impacted by racism, positively or negatively?
Well, yes, I have. So, listening to Dr. Royster in his speaking about what are the predeterminants of a healthy community, I immediately thought to my experience as being an educator for 15 years and how the education system impacts what we all are taught about racism and inferiority and superiority. And so it is one of a lot of things for me, but one of the things I thought of was how a part of having a healthy community has to be being culturally responsive in education. And I thought about how children are taught, and so I kept thinking about how is this possible? We know it happens, but the ways in which it happens is so, I don't know, it's so systematic, and it's hard, it's easy to pass over, to not really think of. But I'll take a concrete example of my son, who's taking an AP history class, and he goes to a predominantly white high school. We live in a predominantly white area, but he studies night after night a lot of so-called historical facts. He's very studious, but we went to a conference for Black History Month, and he learned more in 1 hour from that lecture about Black people than he has all year in his AP history class that he studies for night after night. And so it just made, and he was surprised by it. He's a 15-year-old African-American male who does not have any representations of himself. So it's like, how does that impact him in seeing that who he is, or as a Black male, doesn't matter, or has been basically erased from history? But not only does that that's like a seed of inferiority right there. But not only does that make an impression on him as a young Black male, but think of all the white males and white females who learn the same thing. So they're learning that Blackness doesn't matter. The only time you really learn about Blackness or any other race is if it somehow impacts the trajectory or growth of whiteness in America, or gets in the way of the growth of whiteness in America. And so when you have curriculum in our country that is seeded on that foundation, we all are impacted. So then when you're a doctor and you have a Black woman who comes into your doctor's office and you have been taught not to see her from elementary school, you don't see any Black women, and then you go to a middle school and a high school, and it's the same way, and then you go to college, and it only gets worse because, when I got my master's in English, I was the only Black woman in many of my classes, and I had to speak for black women, but I noticed that, everyone around me was white. And we talked about James Joyce and other white authors. We didn't talk about black authors, so blackness is erased in our education. It's erased in when we learn about what is important. And so you don't see, that doctor doesn't see that black woman in a real way, as a real human being, because even what you learn about slavery, you learn that slaves came over, not sisters, mothers, daughters, people were brought from Africa. It was like slaves. So even in that language, again, you negate a people. It's not people who were enslaved or real human beings. And so you get this one paragraph in your history book about who these people are, and if you have no other experiences, that is how you experience black people. You experience by what's in popular culture. So we have to do something about how we're teaching everyone, because we're the brightness, the brilliance that is African Americans, that is all races. We lose a part of that in erasing that influence or that contribution historically. And so we handicap ourselves, we cripple ourselves as a nation. We can't evolve in the way that we need to. We can't evolve in a way that is timely.
Yeah, Sistah-Talk with Valerie.
If we don't address how we're educating everyone, because it's the foundation of how we see, think, and act.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have a caller?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, caller. Hello? Hi. You're on with Sistah-Talk with Valerie.
Yes, hi, Valerie. This is Pamela from Boston. How are you?
I am fine. How are you?
I'm doing well. I would like to get my little opinion on the topic you are referring to today.
Okay. Absolutely. How has racism impacted you, Pam?
Well, I think the psychological stress impacted will impact the physical health. For me, mostly the unconscious bias that is from a very good nature someone that makes me internalize the legacy of this type of structure, which has impacted job, education, housing, and just the way of life.
Mm-hmm.
And it leads to social globalization that fosters criminal behavior.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Have a great Sunday, and thank you for calling.
It's like, that's all I had to say.
Well, that was powerful what she said.
Yes, it was.
Miss Adyam,
Good morning.
how are you?
I'm good.
Have you been impacted by racism?
I think, yeah. Well, yes. I don't think, but I know, yes. And I think, just as she was saying, I think we take it out and like to even go further in like the education system. What we fail to realize is like Dr. Royster said, it's a systematic thing. So we put our kids in these schools that already don't teach you about yourself, and they already demonize you. But then we demonize them even more by second or third grade, how they start building prison cells for how many kids fail this standardized test that really isn't a standard, and tell you that, oh, because you didn't do this test, you're never good enough. And then we continue to pass these kids on to give them a certificate of completion. And if you don't have a GED, you don't have anything in life. And so, like, you can't even work at McDonald's now. Like, so you're giving me a certificate. I've spent all these years in oppression just to tell me that you already told me where I was going in second grade by the time I'm 18. And so it's a whole system of things. And then to go to, like, the health out, it was so much talked about, but the health outcome back. In my mind, it doesn't matter how much money I make. Like, look at Serena Williams. She still had to fight to say she was in pain. So if you're a millionaire and you can't even get medical treatment because of the skin color, then what makes you think someone that doesn't have any money, that has to rely on the system that's just set up to destroy you, to actually take care of you? And so I think what we think about, like, and I get it, the privilege, it's definitely the privilege. And I can go with Brad. Like, I think more white people don't want to accept it because it's not saying that you didn't work hard. It didn't say that you didn't have struggles in life. It's not saying you didn't do anything. But you had to step up from everybody else. When you look in the environment of where we work at, why is it that majority of African Americans have to have higher degrees but yet are in lower positions than people that have less degrees than them? So, like, I may have a master's and I may be supervised by someone who has a bachelor's. you know, or I may have a PhD and I'm being supervised by someone that has a bachelor's. So it's like we have to work 20 times harder just to make it in the door, yet we're still saying we're not good enough. But then someone else can be in the same position and have nothing and be said that you are great. And I think we don't look at how that impacts. And so my background is East African Eritrean. So when my parents were here, you know, I went to this school and I lived in the all black men, people of color. I had the Latinos, I had the Africans, the black, everybody lived in the neighborhood. But my parents felt like, oh, I have to get a better education because I heard this education isn't good enough. So they took me across town to the private schools with the kids. And what they failed to realize is we separate ourselves so much. Oh, I'm African, so I'm not like this, or I'm Caribbean, so I'm not like this. But at the end of the day, you're still the same person. It doesn't matter it's how you look. Even before you open your mouth, they still demonize you. Just tell you may be a little bit this, but you're still down there. You know, like, oh, you know, like when we look at Africa, we don't look at the monuments, or we don't look at the cities, the skylines, the clubs. We look at the poor kid on the street. That's all we ever see. And so when I went to this school, I didn't really know what racism was. I didn't really know what slavery was because I just did. I knew it happened. And so when the little kids were saying stuff to me, I just said it back. Like, I was in 3rd grade, and I think I shared this with you. Like, this little boy was like, oh, your family hang from trees. My instinct was like, your family hang from trees. I can't do that. You can't hang my family. We do the hanging. Why can't I do? Like, it was just a psychological thing of you telling me I can never do something. And you felt it all through until the time where I just luckily started going to public school, and it just was all better. Like, my grades went up. Everything went up when I was surrounded with people that looked like me. Because that imagery really does play a part. And I was lucky that when I switched schools, there was a lot of black males. And then they also had an African American Studies course that you could take as an elective in high school. They don't have it anymore. And so I had the privilege of learning something. And I was like, so this is what all this meant all these years. Like, I'm not crazy. You know, it wasn't that I wasn't good enough. It was just people were also taught that I wasn't good enough. And so if you're taught this and I'm taught I'm not good enough, then why would I value myself? Why would I value the person that sits next to me? Why would I value the person other? We work so hard to get out these small impacted communities, but when we get out, we're faced with the same thing, and we're wondering why this stress is. So like when she said the stress of the health outcomes, it doesn't matter what aspect you are. Like Dr. Jenkins did a study with asthma, and he looked at like black people with asthma, high stressors. White people with asthma, of course, high stressors. Black people with asthma were almost identical to white people with asthma that didn't have asthma. That's how level of stress you are. So you're telling me that I'm on the same level of stress as someone that actually has something when I don't even have it. And then like white people without asthma were at a lower level. So it's just showing you how the system of race really affects your everyday stress, your health. And we're wondering why we have these higher social determinants. And then when we look at these smaller communities with low income, we don't have food access, we don't have recreational access. It's like literally a small town of everything from every system, from media. We don't even have bus transportation. There's a bus boycott here in Richmond. They're suing the bus station, GRTC, because they're stopping frequencies in these neighborhoods. And so people can't even get to work to provide for their families. So we talk about this system. But we built this lovely expressway to go from one side of town to the other side of town. But we can't even get someone that wants to work because we feel like they're not good enough for us to provide more free transportation to. So we limit from 15 to 30 minutes. In a year, what is it going to be, an hour? So you have to stand outside for 2 hours to get a bus.
And we wonder, there used to be a song, I know the old heads know it. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. And that's exactly how you begin to feel when you are of color. When you are of color. And when I talk about of color, folks, I'm talking about if you are Latino, if you are Native American, if you are Asian American, I'm talking about any other color besides Caucasian color, there is struggles. And so we really have to understand what the struggles are like and how we're more alike than different, that we don't buy into that internal, interracial fighting of each other and other races, and even understanding where our advocates are in the Caucasian race. Okay, because for real, and I'm going to say it, okay, Harriet Tubman has some help from white folks, y'all. Let's tell the truth and shame the devil. So know where your advocates are, but also understand how it impacts us and how we how it impacts us on a day-to-day basis.
Too, also, when you think about white culture, like when you, somebody said this the other day, and I can't remember who said it, so I can't quote them, but they said even in white culture, when you assimilate to the privilege of being white, you lose something from you. So if you're Jewish, if you're Armenian, if you're British, you lose that identity because now you have to assimilate to this to get this privilege. So it's no longer like, what do you like about being Jew? It's like, oh, you're automatically white because I checked this box. But there's so much more to you that can align with other cultures. You have cultures, you have values, you have anything. So in a sense, even when you assimilate and you're white to the culture, you still lose something in yourself because you're losing your previous heritage or your identity to be part of something for the privilege.
And the other thing is that the black culture is the only culture that cannot trace back where we come from. So you hear people say, oh, you know, my folks are from Italy. My name, think about our names, right? We have names that we were given. I'm Valerie McAllister through marriage. My name before my mom's was, you know, Hurling Ford. But that's not something that we can even connect to, where other people can say, oh, I'm something, whatever your last name is, and understand where you can trace that back to, right? Whether it's Czechoslovakia or wherever. Okay, we can't do that. So we can go in our DNA and research. We can't even trace our name does not even belong to us. So if your name doesn't belong to you, I mean, you're already starting from -0. But also, before we go, I wanted to talk a little bit more, Kia, about the educational system, because that's where it starts with our children and what our children see. So what do you see, or what have you seen in the school system in terms of racism?
I think we talked about this the other day about how you can really, in terms of naming something, a lot of times students or people are going to live up to what they've been defined as and what they've been named. And so, you know, I had an example of some students who were called the bad grade level, and they were running down the hallway, and one of the teachers came out and said, you guys are running down the hallway, and one of the students says, like a bunch of hyenas, like monkeys, like hyenas. This is something they've heard. But I stopped them and I said, no, you're students, you're children, and you need to act as such. You know, just having the expectation that you act in a certain way. Children hear and absorb everything. So if they are, from the time they're in elementary school, dubbed or named, you don't know how to act. You won't see children on that side of town acting like this, or why are you, you know, that becomes a part of what defines you. Because when children are younger, we're constantly giving them their identity. We're constantly defining them. So if a society is saying something to you, if you see it in your culture and your community, and your teacher is saying certain things, and you're absorbing it on television, you're going to start to kind of, it's like it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't have any other definition of myself. Or it must be true, because I don't see any representations of myself that I can cling to that is going to build me up or encourage me or motivate me. And that's why I feel like things like, and it should be part of revamping the curriculum, is definitely important, but it has to be it has to be intentional. Black History Month this year, I saw it being kind of erased, even on MLK Day. A lot of people were off of work, but I didn't see schools intentionally celebrating MLK Day. I didn't see schools intentionally celebrating Black History Month. I have a child in elementary school, a child in middle, and a child in high school, and there was only one event for Black History Month. Whereas when I was a child, it was more intentional. There were more things. At least you got that month to celebrate who you were. But if that is not even being done intentionally, think about how much our children are losing, because it's not like they're going to see it anywhere else during the school year. And so we have to, in education, some of the things you can do is writing to your local congressman, becoming a part of your school board. Anybody could be a part of the school board. You don't have to be anyone special. You don't have to have any fancy degree to go to the school board meeting and speak up about, hey, my child had a history test. I didn't see any representations of Black history on the history test. Hey, you guys are using these textbooks from this textbook company. you need to make sure that they're going to be culturally responsive in what they're writing, or we don't want those textbooks in our schools. So things like that, people have more of a voice than they think they do, but we have to be intentional about it so that we can make those changes.
Thank you for that. So as we wrap up, I want to give everybody sort of a last sort of thought, and then I will make my last thought. So, Bradley?
Sorry, I had to get the headset ready. I guess in terms of closing remarks, I would say we need to. It's important that we have conversations about race. That's a call that's been made kind of incessantly for a while. But I think what's really important is that we have to. I think we have to change the way that we talk about race. Like, having the conversation is one thing, but like the content of that conversation is another. I think too often our conversation, and this is from all perspectives, tend to focus on that level one racism, right? This sort of treating racism as this specific personal characteristic that people have. It's like, it's this binary, are they a racist, are they not a racist? I think that's not very productive. I think most people don't think that they're racist. There's a great segment on The Daily Show like years ago where they interviewed members of the Ku Klux Klan who were saying, "Oh, well, we're not racist," right? So I think we need to start talking about these next levels of racism because those are the things that really impact people. I think if we have this perfect utopian society where nobody held any explicitly racist beliefs, we would still see a lot of these disparities in health outcomes that we still do today. So the solution to racism is not just stop being racist. Like, we really have to talk about ways to undo some of these institutional structures, and that means talking more about implicit racism.
Right.
That means talking more about our history and the specific governmental policies that were created specifically to exclude Black people from acquisition of resources, and how those things are still, playing out today. And that we need to really talk about things on the policy level to undo those things, rather than just stopping continuing to actively be racist or whatever. So that would be my closing remark.
That is great. That is wonderful. 2 minutes, Adyam. Final thought, and then Dr. Royster.
Real quick, I really agree with Bradley, because someone said it one time, if we take all the people that are actively racism, we take our 45, we take all the tiki torches, and we sent them off, we would still have the system that we have. So until we work on this system, until we actually address the system and understand that everybody has some type of implicit bias. Even if you're a person of color, sometimes we police ourselves.
Yep.
And so until we understand that and get that root issue and work towards changing policies, work towards the system change, we're still going to be sitting where we're at. So I think what we need to take is racism, instead of taking it against like the people that are actively racist, which is like a very minority population, we need to look at the whole picture, and then we'll really be able to make these changes.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Dr. Royster?
Yeah, I would make hopefully 2 quick points that build on both of what they said. The first, around the idea of implicit racism, that people don't consider themselves to be racist, yet we know that people who would adamantly say they're not, when they go through a test called an implicit association test, which you can find at harvard.edu, you can Google it. Many people find that they do have implicit biases against people of color. And it crosses the spectrum. And so even, we do training on racism, and what I found, we will have very progressive white people in the group who claim to not be racist and, say all the right things, and when they do this implicit bias test, they're very humbled to realize that they do have these implicit biases against people of color. And I think the first thing to recognize is that you shouldn't feel embarrassed by that, because our society has raised us to believe that and to have those implicit biases. But once you know that, you can then act differently and very intentionally to ensure that your actions don't unintentionally further disadvantage people of color. So that's the one thing. And then the second piece is that we all have power to some extent in our world, in our personal lives and our professional lives. And if we are very intentional about using that power, whether we're at the CEO level or at the program level or what have you, we can, on a daily basis, identify and act differently in ways that help to undo the racism that our organizations many times unintentionally perpetuate. And so I encourage all of us then to be very intentional and very thoughtful, whether we're people of color or whether we're white, to embrace this notion that racism is this broader system and that we all need to intentionally act in ways that can undo it.
Thank you so much. I have really enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate my guests and their comments and their feedback. And finally, let me just say that my book, The Cows Return, the book club 2, comes out on March 24th, and I need everyone listening in my listening ear to get a copy of Cows Return, the book club 2. And my last word is that, at the end of the day, we bleed the same blood. We love the same way. So let's try to make our communities better, and let's try to learn and grow. And this is Valerie McAllister with Sistah-Talk with Valerie. And I love you. Ain't nothing you can do about it. Have a great Sunday. Thank you for tuning in to Sistah-Talk with Valerie. Again, for more information about Sistah-Talk with Valerie, contact us at Generation